They said no one wants to date a 78-year-old widow. Then my high school crush walked into the cafe. My hands trembled as I applied lipstick for the third time this morning, the coral shade I'd worn on my first date with Harold 62 years ago. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized, silver hair carefully curled, crow's feet mapping decades of laughter and sorrow, but eyes still holding that spark of anticipation I thought had died with my husband 3 years ago. "You're being ridiculous, Margaret," I whispered to my reflection, but my voice betrayed the flutter in my chest. At 78, I was about to go on my first blind date since Eisenhower was president. My daughter Linda had arranged it through her friend's father-in-law, despite my protests that no sensible man my age would want a widow with arthritic hands and a medicine cabinet that rattled like a maraca. The cafe downtown seemed like neutral territory when Linda suggested it. "Just coffee, Mom. What's the worst that could happen?" She'd said it with that patronizing tone children use when they think they know what's best for their parents. But here I was, checking my watch for the 15th time, wondering if I should have worn the blue dress instead of this burgundy one that Harold always said brought out my eyes. I arrived 15 minutes early, a lifetime habit that Harold used to tease me about. "Maggie, punctuality is a virtue, but showing up before the restaurant opens is just showing off," he'd say, squeezing my hand as we'd wait in the car. The memory hit me like a physical blow, and I had to steady myself against the cafe door. Was I betraying his memory? Was this what people meant when they said I should move on? The barista, a young man with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers, smiled as I approached. "What can I get you started with today?" "Just a coffee, black," I said, then immediately regretted it. Harold drank his coffee black. I preferred cream and sugar, but somehow ordering what he would have ordered felt like bringing him with me. "Actually, could you make that with cream, 2 sugars?" "Of course. First date?" he asked, with the casual intuition of someone who'd witnessed countless nervous encounters across his counter. My cheeks burned. Is it that obvious? The lipstick touch-ups in the reflection of the pastry case gave it away, he grinned. "Don't worry, first dates are nerve-wracking at any age. My grandmother met her second husband when she was 85. They had 10 wonderful years together." Second husband? The words settled in my chest with unexpected comfort. Maybe this wasn't about replacing Harold. Maybe it was about honoring the capacity for love he'd nurtured in me. I chose a corner table where I could see the entrance, a habit from my teaching days when I needed to monitor the classroom door. My purse sat in my lap like armor, containing everything I might need: breath mints, tissues, my emergency inhaler, and a small photo of Harold that I'd been carrying since the funeral. Not because I planned to show it, God forbid, but because it felt wrong to leave him at home. The coffee warmed my hands, and I watched the afternoon crowd filter in and out. Young mothers with strollers, college students hunched over laptops, business people grabbing quick caffeine fixes between meetings. Life happening at every age, everyone moving through their own stories of hope and disappointment and small victories. At exactly 3 o'clock, I saw him through the window. Tall, though not as tall as memory suggested, with silver hair that caught the autumn sunlight. He moved carefully, but with dignity, the way people our age learn to navigate the world when our bodies become less reliable witnesses to our intentions. He wore a navy sweater that looked expensive and well cared for, and when he paused outside to check the address on his phone, I caught a glimpse of his profile. My coffee cup clattered against the saucer. It couldn't be. After 60 years, after marriage and children and grandchildren and loss and life lived fully, it couldn't possibly be him. But when he pushed through the cafe door and our eyes met across the room, I knew with the same certainty I'd felt at 17 when he'd asked me to the spring dance, and I thought my heart might actually explode with joy. David Henley. My first kiss, my first heartbreak, the boy who'd written me poetry on notebook paper and promised we'd run away to California together after graduation, the boy who'd chosen college over love, who'd married someone else, who'd become a story I told Harold when we were first married and still sharing all our secrets. Margaret? His voice was deeper now, weathered by decades of living, but the way he said my name, with that slight upturn at the end, like a question wrapped in wonder, transported me instantly to the gymnasium where we danced to Earth Angel while the crepe paper decorations rustled overhead. I stood too quickly, and my purse tumbled to the floor, spilling its contents across the cafe tiles. Harold's photograph skittered toward David's feet, and I watched in horror as my past and present collided in the most literal way possible. David bent, more slowly than the boy I remembered, but still with that innate courtesy that had made me fall for him in the first place, and retrieved the photo. "Harold Morrison," he said, studying the picture with a sadness that surprised me. "I heard about his passing. Am sorry for your loss, Margaret. He was a good man." "You knew Harold?" The words came out as barely a whisper. My legs felt unsteady, and David quickly moved to help me back into my chair before settling across from me. "We worked together briefly in the 80s, some consulting project for the city." He mentioned being married to his high school sweetheart, and when he showed me a picture of you at the Christmas party, David smiled, and I saw traces of the boy who used to wait for me by my locker between classes. I knew immediately. He was proud of you, Margaret. Talked about your teaching, your children, how you'd built this beautiful life together. The cafe suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. This was supposed to be a simple blind date with a stranger, a tentative step back into the world of companionship. Instead, I was sitting across from the road not taken, the what if that had haunted quiet moments for 6 decades. I don't understand, I managed. Linda said her friend's father-in-law. "My daughter-in-law, Sarah, works with Linda," David explained gently. "When Sarah mentioned that Linda's mother might be ready to meet someone, and Linda showed her your picture," he paused, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm I remembered. "I may have encouraged the matchmaking more than I let on." "You knew it was me? This whole time? You knew?" "I hoped," he said simply. "I've thought about you often over the years, Margaret. Wondered what kind of life you'd build, whether you were happy. When I lost Eleanor 5 years ago, I found myself thinking about all the people who'd mattered to me, and your name was always at the top of that list. Eleanor." His wife of 50-something years, the woman he'd chosen over me, who'd given him the life I'd imagined we might have had together. I should feel jealous or vindicated or something more dramatic than this strange sense of completion. Instead, I felt the overwhelming sadness of time passing, of choices made and unmade, of love that transforms but never truly disappears. "Were you happy?" I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. "With Eleanor? With your life?" "Very happy," he said without hesitation, and I was grateful for his honesty. She was an extraordinary woman. We had 4 children, 8 grandchildren, a good marriage that lasted through everything life threw at us. But that doesn't mean I didn't wonder about you, about us. Some people leave footprints on your heart that never fade completely." The young barista appeared beside our table with a gentle smile. "Could I get you anything else? Another coffee? Maybe something to eat?" David looked at me questioningly, and I realized we'd been sitting here for over an hour, lost in the strange space between past and present. The cafe had grown busier around us, filled with the chatter and clatter of afternoon life, but we'd created our own quiet bubble of memory and possibility. "I should eat something," I admitted. "My blood sugar gets unpredictable if I don't." "2 pieces of that apple pie if you have it," David said to the barista, "and another coffee for the lady." You remember, I said after the young man walked away. Apple pie was your weakness. You always ordered it when we went to Murphy's Diner after the movies. I can't believe you remember that. I remember everything about you, Margaret. The way you always stirred your coffee exactly 12 times, how you hummed when you were concentrating, the face you made when you were trying not to laugh in church. His voice grew softer. I remember the night I told you I was leaving for college and how you cried but told me it was the right thing to do. I remember thinking I was the biggest fool in the world for letting you go. The pie arrived, and with it, the comfortable silence of shared sweetness. I watched David's hands as he ate, still strong, though marked now with age spots and the slight tremor that comes to us all eventually. I wondered if he was comparing me to the girl he remembered, if he was disappointed by what time had done to the face he'd once cupped so tenderly between his palms. "You're staring," he said with amusement. "I'm trying to reconcile the boy I knew with the man sitting across from me." "Are you disappointed?" The question hung between us, loaded with decades of idealization and memory. How could I explain that he was both exactly as I remembered and completely transformed? That his laugh still made my stomach flip, but now it was layered with the wisdom that comes from loving and losing and choosing to love again. "No," I said finally. "You're different, but so am I. We're who we were always meant to become." "Tell me about your life," he said. "All of it, the parts I missed." So I did. I told him about my wedding to Harold, how nervous I'd been walking down the aisle, how Harold had whispered jokes to make me laugh during the ceremony. I told him about my children, Linda, born after 2 miscarriages that nearly broke my heart, and James, who arrived so quickly we barely made it to the hospital. I described my 38 years of teaching, the students who challenged and inspired me, the small victories that had made each day worthwhile. I told him about Harold's diagnosis, the 2-year battle with cancer that had tested everything we thought we knew about love and commitment. How I'd held his hand as he died, whispering promises about keeping his garden blooming and not forgetting to laugh. How the silence in our house afterward had been so complete it felt like another kind of death. David listened with the focused attention I remembered from our teenage conversations, when he'd hang on every word as if I were revealing the secrets of the universe. Now, as then, he made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. "Your turn," I said when I talked myself hoarse. He told me about Eleanor, and I was surprised to find I wasn't jealous, but grateful. Grateful that he'd loved deeply, that he'd known the satisfaction of a partnership that weathered decades. He described his career as an architect, the buildings that bore his signature, the satisfaction of creating spaces where people lived and worked and dreamed. He talked about his children with the particular pride of a parent who'd managed to raise good humans despite the world's complications. And he told me about loss, Eleanor's sudden heart attack while gardening, the way grief had reorganized his entire understanding of time and purpose, how his children worried about him rattling around in the big house they'd shared, how he'd started volunteering at the literacy center just to have somewhere to go on Tuesdays. "I never stopped wondering about you," he said as the afternoon light shifted through the cafe windows, "especially after Eleanor died. I'd lie awake thinking about all the people who'd shaped me, and you were always there, in that category of unfinished business that you carry your whole life." "Unfinished business," I repeated. "Is that what this is?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "What do you think it is?" I considered this as I watched him finish his pie, taking small, deliberate bites, the way people do when they want to make something pleasant last longer. What was this? A chance encounter orchestrated by well-meaning children? A cosmic joke played by the universe on 2 old people who should know better? Or something else entirely? A second chance, not to reclaim what we'd lost, but to discover what we might still find. I think, I said slowly, it's whatever we decide it is. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon crowd thinned. I could see the barista wiping down tables, preparing for the evening shift change. Soon we'd have to leave this safe space and decide what came next. The thought terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. "Would you like to take a walk?" David asked, as if reading my thoughts. "If you're not too tired. There's a park a few blocks from here, and the leaves are beautiful this time of year." I looked out the window at the October afternoon, golden and crisp with the promise of winter coming. When was the last time I'd walked in a park with a man? When was the last time I'd wanted to? "I'd like that," I said. We walked slowly, adjusting our pace to accommodate his hip replacement and my arthritis. The park was indeed beautiful, dressed in the full glory of autumn, and I found myself seeing it through his eyes. The architect's appreciation for the way the paths curved around natural features, how the benches were positioned to catch the best views. "Do you remember the park behind our school?" he asked as we settled on a bench overlooking the pond. "Where you kissed me for the first time?" Under the oak tree that was probably 100 years old even then. I was so nervous I forgot to breathe. "You held your breath for so long, I thought you might faint." We laughed, and the sound seemed to startle a group of ducks who'd been floating peacefully nearby. They swam away in formation, leaving ripples that caught the late afternoon light. "Margaret," David said, and something in his tone made me turn to face him fully. "I need you to know that this isn't about trying to recapture the past. We're different people now. We've both loved deeply, lost deeply, built lives that mattered. I'm not trying to erase any of that or pretend we can be 17 again." "Then what are you trying to do?" "I'm trying to figure out if two people our age can start something new without it being about replacing what came before. If we can honor what we've both lost while still being open to what we might find." I studied his face, the face that had haunted my dreams during my first year of marriage, that I'd trained myself to forget, that now sat before me, weathered and wise and utterly familiar. "And what do you think we might find?" "Companionship, conversation, someone who remembers the songs we danced to and the movies that made us cry. Someone who understands that love at our age isn't about passion as much as it is about not wanting to face the rest of our days alone." It wasn't the most romantic declaration I'd ever heard, but it was perhaps the most honest. At 78, I'd learned to value honesty above poetry, substance above sentiment. "The rest of our days," I repeated. "That's a frightening phrase when you're our age." "All the more reason not to waste them." A group of children ran past us, chasing a soccer ball with the boundless energy of youth. Their laughter echoed across the water, and I found myself smiling at their joy. When Harold and I were their age, we thought we had forever. Now, with David beside me, I was acutely aware of the preciousness of time, how every moment was both a gift and a countdown. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Of what?" "Of everything. Of being too old for this, of what people will think, of disappointing you when you realize I'm not the girl you remember, of feeling guilty about Harold, of my children thinking I'm having some kind of breakdown." I paused, surprising myself with my candor. "Of falling in love again and having to watch another person I care about die." David reached for my hand, and I let him take it. His palm was warm and slightly rough, marked with a lifetime of work and worry. It felt nothing like Harold's hand, and that was somehow both heartbreaking and reassuring. "Those are all valid fears," he said. "I have most of them too. But I've learned something in the past few years that I wish I'd understood when we were young." "What's that?" "Fear is just love trying to protect itself." And protection, while necessary, can also keep us from the very thing we're trying to preserve. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. I thought about Harold, about the life we'd built together, about the promises I'd made at his bedside. I'd promised to keep living, to not let grief consume me, to remember that love was meant to be shared, not hoarded like a precious commodity. But I'd also made promises to myself, to be cautious, to protect my heart, to not be one of those foolish old women who embarrasses their children by acting like a lovesick teenager. The trouble was, sitting here with David, I didn't feel foolish. I felt more like myself than I had in years. "Tell me about your children," I said. "What do they think about their father dating?" David chuckled. "They're worried I'm having a midlife crisis 30 years too late. My son keeps sending me articles about online dating scams, and my youngest daughter bought me a book called Smart Dating for Seniors, as if I'd never navigated human relationships before." Linda gave me the same book, I laughed, along with a lecture about not giving out my social security number on the first date. "Did you bring it, your social security number?" "I brought my whole purse arsenal," I said, patting my bag. "Tissues, mints, emergency medications, and a photo of my late husband to show you in case you turned out to be a creep." "Well, that's practical." "What's the verdict? Am I a creep?" I looked at him seriously. This man who'd been my first love, who'd grown into someone I was still getting to know. "No," I said, "you're something much more dangerous." "Which is?" "You're familiar." The word hung between us, loaded with meaning. Familiar was dangerous at our age because it felt like coming home, like slipping into a comfortable chair after standing too long. Familiar made you forget to be careful, made you think that because you'd known someone once, you could trust them completely now. But familiar also meant understanding, recognition, the comfort of being seen by someone who remembered who you used to be before life carved away your rough edges and taught you to settle for less than you'd once dreamed. "Is familiar good or bad?" he asked. "I think it's both." As the evening approached, we began the slow walk back toward the street where we'd parked. The cafe was closing, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Soon we'd have to say goodbye, return to our separate homes, our separate lives, and decide whether this afternoon had been a lovely interlude or the beginning of something more substantial. "Margaret," David said as we reached my car, "would you have dinner with me? Tomorrow night, if you're free. Nothing fancy. There's a little Italian place near my house that does excellent chicken parmesan and doesn't play the music so loud we can't hear each other talk." I hesitated, my hand on the car door handle. Dinner felt more serious than coffee, more like a real date than this afternoon's reunion. Dinner meant getting dressed up again, meant telling Linda where I was going, meant admitting to myself that I was genuinely interested in seeing where this might lead. "I'd like that," I said before I could talk myself out of it. 6 o'clock? I could pick you up, or if you'd prefer to drive yourself. "I'll drive myself," I said quickly. Independence was something I'd fought to maintain since Harold's death, and I wasn't ready to surrender it, even for the sake of chivalry. "Just give me the address." He wrote it on the back of a business card, his handwriting still as neat and precise as I remembered from the notes he used to slip into my locker. "Margaret Morris Architecture," the card read, and I felt a small thrill seeing his dreams had come true. "Thank you," I said, tucking the card into my purse next to Harold's photograph. "For today, for this, whatever this is." "Thank you for taking the chance," he said, "for not running away when you realized who I was." I thought about it. "I'm glad you stayed." He leaned down and kissed my cheek, a gesture so gentle and tentative it made my throat tight with emotion. For a moment, I was 17 again, dizzy with the possibility of love and terrified of my own feelings. Then I was 78, grateful for the chance to feel dizzy again. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods dressed in autumn glory. My house, when I pulled into the driveway, looked exactly as I'd left it. Harold's roses still blooming against the front porch, the newspaper I'd forgotten to bring in this morning lying yellow and damp on the walkway. But something felt different, as if the house itself knew that I'd stepped outside its protective boundaries and returned changed. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Harold's chair, something I rarely did, but tonight felt like an occasion that called for breaking small rules. I could almost hear his voice, the way he used to debrief our social encounters, asking gentle questions that helped me process whatever emotions the day had stirred up. "Well, Harold," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish, "you'll never guess who I had coffee with today." The house was quiet, but I could swear I felt his presence, not sad or disapproving, but curious and perhaps even amused. Harold had always been secure in our love, never jealous of my past or threatened by the occasional mention of old friends. I thought he might actually approve of David, might be relieved that I wasn't planning to spend the rest of my life talking only to his photograph. The phone rang, interrupting my conversation with the empty air. "Mom?" Linda's voice was bright with barely contained curiosity. "How did it go? Sarah said her father-in-law was very excited about meeting you." I smiled, imagining the network of adult children who'd orchestrated this afternoon, probably texting updates to each other like teenagers planning a surprise party. "It went well," I said carefully. "Just well? Come on, Mom, give me something to work with here. Was he nice? Did you have anything in common? Are you going to see him again?" I considered how much to tell her. Linda meant well, but she still saw me primarily as her mother, not as a woman, capable of romance and desire and the complex emotions that came with both. How could I explain that her simple blind date had turned into a confrontation with my own history, a chance to examine roads not taken, and possibilities still unexplored? "He was very nice," I said finally. "We're having dinner tomorrow night." "Dinner? Mom, that's wonderful! Where is he taking you? What are you going to wear? Do you want me to come over and help you get ready?" "Linda," I laughed, "I've been dressing myself for 78 years. I think I can manage one more dinner outfit." I know. It's just, I'm excited for you. Dad would be happy that you're putting yourself out there." The mention of Harold, casual and confident, brought tears to my eyes. Linda was right. Harold would be happy. He'd probably have opinions about my outfit, suggestions for conversation topics, gentle reminders to be myself and not try too hard to impress anyone. "Yes," I said softly, "I think he would be." After we hung up, I wandered through the house, seeing it with fresh eyes. It was still unmistakably the home Harold and I had built together. His books on the shelves, our wedding china in the cabinet, photographs chronicling decades of shared joy and sorrow. But it no longer felt like a museum dedicated to our marriage. Instead, it felt like the foundation for whatever came next, solid enough to support new experiences without erasing what came before. I pulled out my good black dress, the one I'd bought for Linda's wedding but rarely had occasion to wear. Tomorrow night, I would sit across from David Morris at a small Italian restaurant and continue the conversation we'd begun that afternoon. We would probably talk about our children, our health concerns, our fears about aging and loneliness. We might laugh about teachers we'd both hated in high school or marvel at how much the world had changed since we were young. And maybe, if we were both brave enough, we would talk about the future, not the grand future we'd dreamed of at 17, but the quieter, more precious future available to people our age. Mornings spent reading the paper together, afternoon walks when the weather was nice, someone to call when the news was particularly upsetting or when a grandchild did something remarkable. It wouldn't be the same as what Harold and I had shared. It couldn't be, and I wouldn't want it to be. But it might be something else entirely. A second chance not to recapture youth, but to discover what love looked like when it was seasoned with wisdom and sweetened by the knowledge of how rare and precious it truly was. The next evening, I stood before my bedroom mirror, adjusting the necklace Harold had given me for our 40th anniversary. My hands were steadier than they'd been the day before, my breathing more controlled. I'd spent the day in familiar routines, grocery shopping, tending to Harold's roses, calling my sister in Phoenix. But underneath the normalcy, I'd felt a current of anticipation that reminded me why people fell in love in the first place. The restaurant David had chosen was perfect, intimate without being pretentious, busy enough to provide background noise for awkward silences, but not so crowded that we'd have to shout to hear each other. I arrived exactly on time, a compromise between my usual early arrival and the fashionably late entrance Linda had suggested. David was already there, standing when he saw me approach. He wore a sports coat over dark slacks and had gotten a haircut since yesterday, which touched me in a way I hadn't expected. He'd made an effort, just as I had, and somehow that mutual attention to presentation felt like a small declaration of intent. "You look beautiful," he said, and the simplicity of the compliment was more effective than any elaborate poetry might have been. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." We settled into our booth, and the waiter appeared almost immediately with menus and water glasses. I was grateful for the ritual of ordering. It gave us something to focus on besides the strange intimacy of sitting across from each other in the golden light of the restaurant chandelier. "The chicken parmesan is excellent," David said, "but everything here is good. Eleanor and I used to come here for special occasions." The mention of his wife was natural, unforced, and I appreciated that he didn't try to pretend she hadn't existed. Harold had been part of my conversation yesterday. It was only fair that Eleanor would be part of tonight's. "Tell me about her," I said. "What was she like?" David smiled, his eyes taking on the soft focus that comes when people remember someone they loved deeply. She was a librarian, incredibly organized, but with a secret wild streak that always surprised me. She could recite poetry from memory and fix a broken faucet with equal skill. She made the world's worst coffee, but the most incredible chocolate cake, and she never missed a single one of our kids' school plays, even when they were terrible. "She sounds wonderful." She was. She would have liked you, I think. You both had that quality of paying attention, really listening when people talked to you, making them feel like what they had to say mattered. The comparison warmed me, and I felt something relax in my chest that I hadn't realized was tense. "Eleanor wasn't my competition. She was simply another woman who'd loved David well, who'd helped shape him into the man sitting across from me now." "Harold would have liked you too," I said. "He always admired people who built things, who left something tangible behind. He would have enjoyed talking to you about your projects." We ordered the chicken parmesan for both of us, a shared salad, a bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spent on a week's groceries, but felt appropriate for the occasion. As we waited for our food, David reached across the table and took my hand, the gesture now familiar enough to feel natural. "I have a confession," he said. My stomach tightened. "Oh?" "Yesterday wasn't as accidental as I let on." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've known where you lived for the past 5 years. I've driven past your house at least a dozen times, always talking myself out of stopping. When Eleanor died and I was cleaning out her things, I found a Christmas card you and Harold had sent us about 15 years ago. Eleanor had kept it because she said the picture of your family was lovely, but seeing your address again, it felt like a sign." I stared at him, processing this information. "You've been stalking me?" "God, no," he said quickly. "Never anything like that. I needed to know you were okay, that you were happy. I never got out of the car, never bothered you." But sometimes when I was having a particularly difficult day, I'd drive through your neighborhood and see the roses Harold planted or your car in the driveway, and it would reassure me that some people do get to keep their happy endings. The revelation should have unsettled me, but instead I found it oddly comforting. The idea that David had carried some concern for my well-being through all these years, that had found solace in the simple evidence of my continued existence, felt like a form of love so pure it took my breath away. When Linda's friend mentioned setting up her mother, he continued, and described a retired teacher named Margaret who'd recently lost her husband, I knew it had to be you. I may have encouraged the matchmaking more aggressively than was entirely honest. So this whole elaborate setup was my rather pathetic attempt to see you again without having to explain why I'd kept track of you for half a decade. I laughed, surprising both of us. David Morris, you're a 79-year-old man who orchestrated an elaborate blind date charade just to have coffee with your high school girlfriend. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or evidence that you need more hobbies. Maybe both. Our food arrived and we ate slowly, savoring both the meal and the conversation. David told me about his architectural projects, libraries and schools and community centers designed to bring people together. I told him about my former students, the ones who still sent Christmas cards 20 years after graduation, the small ways teachers get to see their influence ripple forward through time. The wine loosened our tongues and softened the edges of our caution. We talked about books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the peculiar challenges of being old enough to have lived through so much history that current events felt like repetitions of earlier themes. Do you ever feel like a time traveler? David asked as we lingered over coffee and shared a piece of tiramisu. Like you're carrying around all these decades of experience that younger people can't even imagine. All the time, I said. Sometimes I look at my grandchildren with their phones and their concerns about climate change and social media, and I want to tell them about a time when the biggest worry was whether the Soviets were going to drop a bomb on us. But then I realize every generation thinks the previous one couldn't possibly understand their problems. The privilege of surviving long enough to gain perspective, and the burden of watching so many people not survive to share it with you. We'd wandered into melancholy territory, but it didn't feel depressing. Instead, it felt like the kind of conversation only people our age could have, honest about loss without being consumed by it, aware of mortality without being paralyzed by fear. Margaret, David said, as the restaurant began to empty around us, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever answer you give is fine with me. My heart rate picked up. Okay. Would you consider seeing me regularly? Not just dates, but companionship. Someone to go to movies with, to call when something interesting happens, to have dinner with on Sundays when the house feels too quiet? The question was exactly what I'd been hoping for, and exactly what terrified me. Regular companionship meant expectations, routines, the gradual intertwining of lives that had been separate for so long. It meant introducing David to my children, explaining our history, fielding questions about our intentions and our timeline, and what exactly we thought we were doing at our age. But it also meant not facing the rest of my days alone. It meant having someone who remembered the world we'd grown up in, who understood the particular challenges of bodies that were failing and minds that sometimes forgot where they'd put their keys. It meant the possibility of love again, not the desperate passion of youth, but the deeper, steadier affection of people who knew how precious and fleeting happiness could be. I'd like that, I said simply. I'd like that very much. The relief on his face was so obvious it made me smile. Really? You're not just being polite? David, at my age, I don't have time for politeness about important things. If I didn't want to see you again, I'd tell you. Good, Because I was prepared to resort to more elaborate schemes if necessary, and I'm running out of relatives to involve in fake setups. We paid the check, David insisted, I let him, and we both pretended it wasn't a small negotiation about independence versus chivalry and walked slowly to our cars. The October evening was crisp and clear, with stars visible despite the city lights. I found myself noticing details I'd missed on the walk from the parking lot. The way David held doors without making a show of it, how he automatically slowed his pace to match mine, the careful way he helped me navigate the uneven pavement without being condescending about it. "This feels like the end of a first date," he said when we reached my car. "Technically, it is." "No," he said thoughtfully. "Yesterday was the first date. This feels like the second date. Tomorrow, when I call to see how you're doing, that will be the beginning of whatever comes next." I liked his certainty, the way he assumed there would be a tomorrow phone call, whatever comes next. At 17, David had been cautious about making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. At 79, he seemed to have learned that life was too short for excessive hedging. "What time do you usually call people?" I asked. "Is there a wrong time to call someone you're courting?" Courting, the old-fashioned word, made me smile. I suppose not. Though I should warn you, I'm not at my best before my second cup of coffee. Noted, and I should warn you that I'm one of those people who calls to share random thoughts. Eleanor used to say I treated the phone like my personal broadcasting system. I like random thoughts. Harold was more of a strong, silent type. I missed having someone to think out loud with. David stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his aftershave, something subtle and expensive that reminded me of wood smoke and autumn leaves. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, really kiss me, not just the polite peck on the cheek from yesterday. The possibility made my pulse quicken in a way that felt both thrilling and absurd. Instead, he took my hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles in a gesture so courtly it could have been lifted from a Jane Austen novel. "Thank you for dinner," I said, though the words felt inadequate for everything the evening had encompassed. "Thank you for saying yes. To dinner, to seeing me again, to taking a chance on whatever this is." I drove home with the radio playing softly, old songs that transported me back to various eras of my life. When The Way You Look Tonight came on, I remembered dancing with Harold at our wedding, how young and invincible we felt, how certain we were that love was enough to conquer anything life might throw at us. We'd been wrong about the conquering part. Life had thrown plenty our way, and love hadn't prevented loss or pain or the slow accumulation of small heartbreaks that came with being human. But love had made it all bearable, had given meaning to both the joy and the sorrow. Now, at 78, I was contemplating love again, not as a shield against life's difficulties, but as a companion through them. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't quite articulate why. At home, I changed into my nightgown and made myself a cup of tea, settling into Harold's chair with the evening paper I'd neglected to read. The house felt different again, not empty exactly, but expectant, as if it too was adjusting to the possibility of change. The phone rang just as I was finishing the crossword puzzle. "I know I said I'd call tomorrow," David's voice was warm through the receiver, "but I realized I forgot to tell you something important." "What's that?" "I had a wonderful time tonight, both nights actually. I wanted to make sure you knew that before another day passed." The simple declaration made my throat tight with emotion. How long had it been since someone had called just to tell me they'd enjoyed my company? How long since I'd felt worthy of such calls? "I had a wonderful time too," I said. "Good. Sleep well, Margaret. I'll talk to you tomorrow." "Good night, David." I sat in the quiet living room for a long time after we hung up, thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, I'd been a widow learning to accept that the romantic portion of my life was over. tonight, I was a woman with plans, with someone to call, with the prospect of Sunday dinners and shared movies and all the small intimacies that made life richer. It wasn't the same as being young and in love, with decades stretching ahead like an endless summer. Instead, it was something perhaps more precious, the chance to experience affection seasoned with wisdom, companionship sweetened by the knowledge of how rare and fragile it was. 3 weeks later, I found myself in David's kitchen, watching him attempt to make pancakes while I sat at his breakfast table with my coffee and the Sunday crossword puzzle. He'd invited me for brunch, promising his famous pancakes, though it was becoming clear that fame and skill were not necessarily related. "I think you might be burning them," I observed as smoke began rising from the pan. "They're not burned, they're caramelized. Is that what we're calling it?" He flipped one of the pancakes, revealing a surface that was indeed more caramelized than any pancake had a right to be. "Eleanor always handled the fancy cooking," he admitted. "I was more of a sandwich and soup man." "Harold couldn't cook at all," I said. "He once tried to make me breakfast in bed for our anniversary and nearly set the kitchen on fire." After that, cooking was strictly my department. What was his department? Fixing things, car maintenance, anything that required tools or getting dirty. He could take apart any appliance and put it back together better than it was before. "Complementary skills," David said, scraping the burned pancakes into the trash. Eleanor balanced our checkbook and navigated anywhere we drove. I designed the kitchen renovations and killed the spiders. What happens when you lose your other half? The question came out more philosophical than I'd intended. David turned from the stove to look at me. "You learn to do their jobs badly until you figure out how to do them adequately, and you appreciate what they brought to the partnership in a way you maybe didn't when they were there to do it. I had to learn how to use the lawnmower. Harold always said the yard was his domain, but when he got sick, I trailed off, remembering those first few months after the funeral when every small task had felt like a mountain to climb. I had to learn how to grocery shop for one person," David said. "Eleanor always did the shopping, and she had this system, coupons and lists and a route through the store that maximized efficiency. It took me 6 months to stop buying enough food for a family of 4. "Are you still buying too much food?" "Sometimes. Old habits." He gestured at the abundance of ingredients scattered across his counter. Hence the elaborate brunch for 2 people. I stood and moved to the stove, gently taking the spatula from his hand. "Let me try. I have 40 years of experience preventing Harold from burning down kitchens." "I thought you might want to maintain your independence in the cooking department." "Independence doesn't mean doing everything alone. Sometimes it means knowing when to accept help and when to offer it." We worked together, David measuring ingredients while I managed the actual cooking. It was a small thing, this kitchen choreography, but it felt significant. Our first real collaboration, our first negotiation of domestic space. I was acutely aware of his presence behind me as I poured batter into the pan, the way he moved around me to get syrup from the cabinet, how naturally we seemed to anticipate each other's movements. "Better?" he asked when I presented him with a plate of golden, properly cooked pancakes. "Much better, though I have to say, even the burned ones were charming in their own way." Charming is one word for them. We ate at his kitchen table, which overlooked a small garden where the last of the season's flowers were putting on a brave show despite the approaching frost. David's house was smaller than the one Harold and I had shared, but it felt comfortable, lived in without being cluttered. I could see Eleanor's influence in the careful arrangement of books, the way family photographs were grouped on surfaces, the general sense that this was a home where people had been happy. "Tell me about your week," David said as we lingered over coffee. It was such a simple request, but it reminded me how long it had been since anyone had asked. Linda called regularly, but our conversations focused on her life, her children, her concerns about my well-being.
David's question was different. He wanted to know about my days not because he was worried about me, but because he was interested in the small details that made up my life. So I told him about the library volunteer meeting where we'd planned the upcoming book sale, about my neighbor's new puppy who'd discovered the joys of digging in flower beds, about the letter I'd received from a former student who was now a grandmother herself. Small things, ordinary things, but David listened with the focused attention that made each anecdote feel worth telling. "Your turn," I said when I'd exhausted my week's worth of news. David told me about a consultation he'd done for a young couple renovating an old Victorian, how their enthusiasm reminded him of his early days in architecture when every project felt like the chance to change the world. He'd visited Eleanor's grave and brought her tulips, a ritual he maintained every Sunday, though he'd found himself telling her about me and wondering what she'd think of his tentative venture back into companionship. "Does it feel strange?" I asked, telling her about me. "Not strange exactly, more like asking for permission, or maybe her blessing."
Eleanor was always generous about the people I cared about. I think she'd want me to be happy. Harold and I used to talk about what we'd want for each other if one of us died first. It was a theoretical conversation then, just one of those middle-of-the-night discussions married couples have. But he was very clear that he didn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone. "What did you tell him you'd want for him?" "The same thing, though I'll admit I was secretly convinced I'd die first. Harold was 3 years older, and men tend to have shorter lifespans. I never seriously prepared for being the one left behind. None of us prepare for that, not really. You can have practical conversations about wills and insurance, but the emotional reality, that's something you can only learn by living through it." We were venturing into the territory of grief again, but it felt natural, necessary even. Our shared experience of loss was part of what made our connection possible. We both understood the weight of love, the cost of attachment, the way happiness was always shadowed by the knowledge of its fragility. "David," I said carefully, "can I ask you something personal? Everything we've talked about has been personal. This is different, more intimate." He set down his coffee cup and gave me his full attention. "Ask me anything. Do you think about the future? About how much time we might have, I mean?" Does it scare you that we're starting something when we're both closer to the end than the beginning? The question hung between us, weighted with all the fears I'd been carrying since that first afternoon in the cafe. It was the elephant in the room of every late-life romance, the mathematics of mortality, the probability that whatever we built together would be measured in years rather than decades. "I think about it every day," David said quietly. "And yes, it scares me. The idea of falling in love again only to lose it again, that's terrifying. But you know what scares me more?" "What?" "The idea of spending whatever time I have left playing it safe, of letting fear rob me of the possibility of joy just because that joy might not last as long as I'd like." His words hit me with the force of truth I'd been avoiding. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from future pain that I'd nearly talked myself out of present happiness. "When Harold was dying," I said slowly, "I used to think that if I'd known what was coming, the diagnosis, the treatments, watching him fade away, I might have chosen not to fall in love with him in the first place. It seemed like it would have been easier to never love at all than to love and lose. But I was wrong. Even knowing how it ended, even living through the worst of it, I wouldn't trade a single day of our life together. The love was worth the loss, even when the loss nearly destroyed me." And now? Now I'm trying to remember that lesson, that love is always a risk, at any age, but the alternative is a kind of death while you're still breathing. David reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture that had become our signature form of connection. "So what do we do with that knowledge?" "I think," I said, surprising myself with my certainty, "we choose love anyway. We choose it knowing it's temporary, knowing it might hurt, knowing we're old enough that people will think we're foolish. We choose it because the alternative is settling for safety when what we really want is to feel alive. Are you sure? Because once we go down this path, really go down it, there's no pretending we're just friends having dinner occasionally. I looked around his kitchen at the morning light streaming through windows Eleanor had probably chosen, at this man who'd loved one woman deeply and was now offering me the chance to love again. I thought about my empty house, my quiet evenings, my careful routines designed to make solitude bearable. Then I thought about the alternative: shared mornings, conversation that mattered, someone to care about, and someone who cared about me. "I'm sure," I said. The smile that spread across David's face was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. "In that case," he said, "would you like to go away with me next weekend? There's a bed and breakfast in Vermont that Eleanor and I always meant to visit but never did."
It's probably our last chance to see the fall foliage this year. A weekend away. The suggestion was innocent enough on the surface, but we both understood the implications. Separate rooms, certainly, at our age and stage of relationship. But the intimacy of shared meals, shared experiences, the kind of extended time together that would either confirm our compatibility or reveal the cracks that casual dating could hide. "I'd love to," I said without hesitation. "Really? You don't need to think about it, check your calendar, consult your daughter?" "David, I'm 78 years old. If I can't make spontaneous decisions about weekend trips by now, when can I?" He laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen with such warmth that I felt something shift inside me, some final wall of caution crumbling away. This was really happening. Against all odds, despite all the sensible reasons to maintain our careful distance, we were becoming something more than friends, something that might actually deserve the word love. The following Friday, I stood in front of my bedroom closet, staring at clothes that suddenly seemed inadequate for the occasion. What did one pack for a romantic weekend at 78? My wardrobe consisted mainly of practical items: comfortable shoes, easy-care fabrics, colors that didn't show stains. Nothing that suggested passion or adventure, or the kind of woman who went away for weekends with men she was falling in love with. Linda had offered to take me shopping, an offer I declined more out of pride than practicality. But now, faced with the reality of packing, I wondered if I should have accepted her help. Did I even own anything that qualified as lingerie? And more importantly, did I want to? The thought of physical intimacy both thrilled and terrified me. Harold and I had maintained an active romantic life well into our 70s, but that was different. We'd grown old together, our bodies changing gradually, our expectations adjusting naturally over time. With David, I felt the peculiar vulnerability of a woman my age, contemplating being seen, really seen, by someone new. I settled on my good jeans, a soft blue sweater that Linda said brought out my eyes, and my most comfortable walking shoes. For evening, a simple black dress that had served me well at various family celebrations. Practical choices, but I added a silk scarf that had been a gift from Harold, a small concession to vanity that made me feel more like the woman I used to be. David arrived promptly at 10, his car loaded with what appeared to be enough supplies for a week in the wilderness rather than 2 nights at a country inn. "I may have overpacked," he admitted as he helped me load my much smaller bag into his trunk. "What exactly did you bring?" "Emergency snacks, a first aid kit, maps in case the GPS fails, a blanket for stargazing, 2 different jackets depending on the weather, my camera, and enough coffee for a small army." "You do realize we're going to a bed and breakfast, not camping in the Adirondacks." Eleanor used to say I packed like I was preparing for the apocalypse.
Old habits. I liked this glimpse into his relationship with Eleanor, the way he could reference her without sadness, as if she were still part of his daily life in the best possible way. It boded well for our own future. If David could honor his first love while embracing a second one, perhaps I could do the same. The drive to Vermont was one of those perfect October days when the world seemed to be showing off. The trees were at peak color, the sky was a blue so clear it looked artificial, and David turned out to be an excellent travel companion. He'd researched our route carefully, pointing out historical markers and scenic overlooks, but he was also content with comfortable silence when conversation wasn't necessary. "Do you mind if I ask what changed your mind?" he said as we wound through a particularly spectacular stretch of maple-lined road. "About what?" "About us. 3 weeks ago, you were so cautious I thought you might bolt if I moved too quickly. Now you're spending the weekend with me in Vermont. What shifted?" I considered the question as I watched the landscape roll past. What had changed? The gradual accumulation of phone calls? Certainly. The way David had integrated himself into my routine without overwhelming it. The growing certainty that my feelings for him were real, not just loneliness dressed up as romance. I realized I was letting fear make my decisions for me, I said finally. After Harold died, I built this careful life where nothing could hurt me, but nothing could really touch me either. It was safe, but it wasn't living. And now? Now I'm choosing to live, whatever that means, however long it lasts. Even if it means risking getting hurt again? Especially if it means that. The bed and breakfast was everything the website had promised. A white colonial farmhouse surrounded by sugar maples, with a wide porch and rocking chairs positioned to catch the afternoon sun. Our rooms were on the second floor, across the hall from each other, arrangement that felt both proper and full of possibility. "This is beautiful," I said as we checked in, admiring the antique furnishings and the bowl of fresh apples on the front desk. "Eleanor would have loved it," David said, then caught himself. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep mentioning her." "Don't apologize. She was a huge part of your life. I'd be worried if you tried to pretend she didn't exist." The innkeeper, a woman about my daughter's age with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes, showed us to our rooms. Mine overlooked the garden, where late-season flowers were putting on a brave display despite the overnight frost. David's room faced the mountains, and when he opened his door to show me the view, I felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation. "Dinner's not until 7, he said. "Would you like to take a walk? There's supposed to be a trail through the woods that leads to a waterfall." A walk in the woods with a man I was falling in love with? It sounded like something from the romance novels I'd read as a teenager, when I'd believed life would be a series of picturesque moments punctuated by passionate embraces. Reality, I'd learned, was messier and more complicated, but sometimes, if you were very lucky, it offered moments of pure beauty that rivaled anything fiction could provide. The trail was well-maintained and not too challenging for people our age, winding through stands of birch and oak that rustled overhead like nature's own cathedral. David walked beside me, pointing out interesting trees and rock formations, but mostly we enjoyed the kind of comfortable silence that comes when two people are perfectly content to be in each other's company. The waterfall, when we reached it, was modest but lovely, a 20-foot cascade that had carved a small pool in the rocks below. David pulled a thermos of coffee from his backpack. Of course, he'd brought coffee, and we sat on a fallen log to admire the view. "This is nice," I said, which felt like an understatement. "It's perfect," David replied, and I realized he wasn't just talking about the scenery. We sat in peaceful quiet, sipping coffee and watching the play of light on water. I felt Harold's presence, not as an intrusion or a source of guilt, but as a gentle blessing. He'd loved nature, loved moments of simple beauty, and I thought he'd approve of this, his wife finding joy again in the company of a good man. "Margaret," David said softly, "may I kiss you?" The question was so formal, so courtly, that it made me smile. "You may."
He set down his coffee cup and turned to face me fully. His hands cupped my face with infinite gentleness, and when his lips met mine, I felt 17 and 78 simultaneously. The girl who'd never been properly kissed, and the woman who understood exactly how precious this moment was. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deeper as we remembered how to move together. It tasted like coffee and autumn air and the particular sweetness of affection long delayed. When we finally broke apart, I rested my forehead against his, marveling at how natural this felt, how right. "I've been wanting to do that since the first day in the cafe," he admitted. "What took you so long?" "I wanted to be sure you wanted it too." "I did. I do." He kissed me again, and this time I let myself fully inhabit the moment. The warmth of his mouth, the way his thumb traced my cheekbone, the sound of water falling over rocks and wind moving through leaves. This was what I'd been afraid of losing when Harold died, not just companionship or comfort, but this particular intimacy, this connection that made you feel known and desired and fully alive. When we finally made our way back to the inn, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. David took my hand as we walked, and I marveled at how natural the gesture felt, how easily we'd slipped into the rhythm of coupledom. "Are you hungry?" he asked as we reached the front porch. "Starving." "Good. I have it on good authority that the pot roast here is exceptional." Dinner was served in a small dining room with only 6 tables, all occupied by other couples who looked to be roughly our age. I wondered if we looked as obviously smitten as some of them did, whether our newfound romance was written across our faces for anyone to see. The pot roast was indeed exceptional, tender and savory, and accompanied by vegetables that had clearly been grown in local soil. We shared a bottle of wine, a small rebellion against the medications we both took that carried warnings about alcohol, and talked about everything and nothing: books we'd read, places we'd traveled, dreams we'd harbored and abandoned, and sometimes found again. "Tell me something I don't know about you," David said, as we lingered over dessert. "What kind of something?" "Anything, a secret, a dream, something you've never told anyone else." I thought for a moment, sipping the wine that had made me feel both relaxed and bold. "I always wanted to write a book," I said finally. "What kind of book?" "A novel, something about women like me, ordinary women living ordinary lives that turn out to be more extraordinary than they initially appear. I had this idea about a woman who discovers letters hidden in her grandmother's attic that reveal a completely different version of the family history than the one she'd always known."